Well, I want to thank everyone for being here this morning. When I was first approached, actually before I start, I want to make sure I thank both Dr. Baker and Dr. Stover for a great introduction. Also want to thank all the student organizers and volunteers here for today for putting on such a great event. Well, I was very humbled and honored to be approached to do this talk. As soon as those feelings wore off, I became terrified about what was I going to say. Typically, when someone finds out about an acquaintance or a friend about my background in political science, they ask me who's going to win the next election. And despite my background in international relations, like a good academic, I give them an expert opinion about who's going to win. But I didn't think that was going to fly today with this crowd. So what I wanted to talk about, given our theme of memories in the world, was specifically how is it a better understanding of international politics can help us understand our memories of the past, and more importantly, how it might change our future for the better. And so that is what my talk will be about today. Very briefly, to give you some perspectives on international politics, scholars of international relations tend to see outcomes in the international system one of three ways. Either they emphasize power in pursuit of survival determines outcomes in the system. They emphasize rules determine outcomes in the international system, either international institutions or democracy. Or they emphasize social process. That social process determines outcomes in the international system. So how we behave and think matters. And this is what the perspective I'll be concentrating on today, how social process can help us understand the past and possibly change our future. So the ways we view the past. There are three words I'm going to be concentrating on today: conflict, cynical, and cynicism, and change. Now, in full disclosure, I originally came up with words that started with the letter of F. But then I realized when I was talking about, if someone asked me about my TED Talk, I didn't want to say my TED Talk was about a bunch of F words. So we ended up with conflict, cynical, and change, right? So conflict. One of the things I want to show is that our memories of the past tend to emphasize adversarial relationships. So specifically how we understand how social process can influence our relationship with other states in the international system. Also, I want to talk about how typically, or very often, our memories of the past tend to have a cynical nature. That our memories of the past tend to rationalize atrocities and other bad events that happen in the international system. And then finally, I want to end with talking about change, how understanding how social process not only influences our past memories, but also how it could lead to possible positive future change. So conflict. What this graph shows is something that international relations scholars have identified probably in the last decade or so, is that no matter how we count it up, whether it's wars between states, conflicts within states, civil wars or whatnot, or total amount of conflicts in the system, we've seen a marked decline in conflicts in the international system since the end of the Cold War. However, paradoxically, this graph shows that despite the decline in conflicts in the international system, military spending has pretty much stayed flat, if not increased at times. And it averaged, so between this period, 1988 to 2013, averages about $1.3 trillion a year are spent on military purposes. So I asked myself, what kind of accounts, despite conflicts going down, what accounts for this kind of vigilant military spending? And what I think the answer might actually get at is how social process matters. That in particular, how we think and feel about other states in the international system can very much color the types of relationships we have. And what I'm hoping to do is by showing a past relationship that we have had, the United States has had with another country, in this case the Soviet Union, I can show how this influence of social process occurs. So what this picture shows is a Time magazine cover from 1933 of Joseph Stalin. The social context right now is during, we're in the Great Depression, right? There's economic problems. At the same time, there's this great collectivization program going on in the Soviet Union that some would say is responsible for the death of millions. And as of right now, given this social context, what we see the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union be is one of rivalry or adversary. However, if we fast forward about 10 years, what we see is the social context has changed. And because of that, we've also seen the relationship has changed as well. So these images on the left here are Time magazine covers from 1939 and 1942 respectively, where Joseph Stalin is now the man of the year. Right? Before 33, he's a murderer, now he's man of the year. And this culminates in this kind of new type of relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. This picture here of the big three at the end of World War II. Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. However, if we fast forward about another 10 years, right, we see the social context change again. Now we are in the midst of the Red Scare, anti-communist hysteria in the 1950s, and this Time magazine cover kind of represents the new relationship we have with the Soviet Union. One where we see very much a fear of Soviet domination of the world. And so what I'm hoping to show by these images is how the social context itself, social processes, can impact how we think about the relationships with other states. Now, this is not to discount strategic elements either. These do matter. However, this doesn't mean that we should forget how the social context of social process can also influence the relationship that we have with other states. And what I'd like to show from that is we can see elements of this with some of our current relationships with states in the international system. So here's an image associated with a Time magazine cover of China in 1963. And here the social context is one of the Cold War, and the magazine cover very much kind of represents the relationship we have with China at the time, one of adversary or rival. We fast forward about 20 years, and we see this relationship has changed. Right? Why? Partly, we've seen some strategic dynamics change, but we've also seen the social context change. We've seen the opening of China by Nixon. We see the switching of recognition from Taiwan to China. And this is kind of representing this new Time magazine cover, right? A smiling Chinese citizen on the Great Wall with a Coke in his hand. Now we fast forward to where we are today, and it seems to be we have two narratives to choose from. One, some policymakers and academics would have us believe this is the relationship we'll have with China. That China is the rising power, and we see the relationship very much colored by terms such as deterrence, containment. But there's another narrative out there, and this is kind of represented very much in this narrative about China's peaceful rise. And what I'd hope to show is that we're not inevitably locked into conflict or conflictual relationships with states in the international system. No doubt there are strategic interests out there, that states have preferences, but by accounting for the social context as well, by not locking ourselves into these adversarial relationships, I think that we can see that relationships in the international system can develop and be more positive. So this brings us to the second point, about how at times our memories of the past seem to be cynical. And what I think is a very good context to show this kind of cynicism is when we look at how we view past human rights abuses. So this graph right here shows us casualty figures, the number of people killed in some major human rights abuse events or conflicts that have probably occurred in the last 20th century. So at the low end, we have the Bosnian conflict with around 40,000 killed. At the high end, we have the Rwandan genocide with around 800,000 killed. And these are just, I do not do justice to say that these are very wide coverage of the human rights abuses that we've experienced in the last 20 years. But despite this idea and the atrocities we see in these events, we seem to, despite the fact that we very much often say never again when we talk about these types of situations, it seems like our typical attitude is it's happening again. And this is not just about when we talk about human rights abuses or the killing of civilians. This seems to be an attitude we talk about when we talk about the vulnerability of some of the least of us, those who are the most vulnerable in the world. And this graph shows the number of refugees that have been generated in the international system in about the last decade. Right? And what we've seen between 2003 and 2012 is a doubling of the number of refugees or displaced persons in the system. And to put this in very stark terms, what this means is in 2003, we were generating somewhere around a little over 10,000 refugees a day across the globe. In 2012, that rate was probably closer to 25,000 a day. And if we were to add the recent totals from conflicts such as the Syrian conflict or the one in the Central African Republic, I suspect that these numbers are even higher. And in some ways, I want to say I almost feel like a hypocrite talking about this. Because I remember when I was a graduate student training to be a professor, I thought the way I was supposed to approach this subject was in a very clinical, dispassionate, emotionally detached perspective, right? That what I could do, what the best way I could talk about these events for my students was just laying out the facts, right? And using certain terms such as the dynamics of genocide, right? What are the causal factors associated with human rights abuses? And very quickly I realized that this is a type of attitude that generates this type of cynicism I'm talking about. That in a way, what I was looking at when I was looking at these casualty figures was no different than what I was looking at if I was looking at census figures or some demographic figures. And I realized that what this engenders is an attitude of bad things happen in bad places, right? It just occurs. It's bad, but there's not a lot we can do about it. And I think in general we have this attitude because of this. At times we feel helplessness when we see these types of events occur. What are we supposed to do when states themselves aren't going to do anything? And what we've seen in particular in certain types of these situations that we as individuals aren't powerless. And here I'm thinking about the Darfur campaign associated with the Stop Genocide Now campaign. Specifically, this was a campaign of individual activists that became socially mobilized, whether they be individual college students across campuses, whether it be in the United States or other parts of the world, whether it was practitioners in NGO networks that were sick of the mass rapes and violence that we had seen in Darfur. And what we saw was not only concentrated social mobilization of these activists, but we also saw concrete results. In the economic context, we saw movement towards divestments, any sort of getting institutions and companies from not investing in the Sudan. On the political front, we saw also some progress where we saw the indictment of the Sudanese leader for human rights abuses by the International Criminal Court. Now, I don't want to sit there and say that this solved Darfur's problem. There are still problems in Darfur. We still see atrocities. But I think this shows that change is possible and that as individuals, we are not powerless. And by collectively harnessing our social will, that we can take action when states will not. And so this brings us to change. And one thing I'd like to note is I don't think we need human rights abuses to happen on a wide scale or other sorts of atrocities to happen for change to occur. And a good example of this is something called the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. These were a set of human development goals and public health indicators that they wanted to increase right around 2000. And what I think was very different about this and really highlights this idea of social process can lead to change was specifically the elements where we saw this completely different way of thinking. Right? Beforehand, when we saw these types of problems, these are domestic issues. They belong to these are problems of a certain country. These are problems of a certain region. But in the UN Millennium Development Goals, what we saw was a sea change in how we were going to approach this problem, how we were going to think about this problem. This is a problem, we saw this problem as a global problem. And what this problem needed was not only a global marshaling of resources, right? We needed material abilities to affect it, but also we needed a global marshaling of social will. That these weren't going to be considered country problems, regional problems anymore, they were global problems. And through this type of different way of thinking and action, we've seen some marked progress on some of the goals they had. So in particular, when we look at poverty reduction, what we've seen since 1990 to 2010 is about a 50% decrease in those who live in what we call extreme poverty, those who live on less than $1.25 a day. We've seen these improvements also in children's health. The mortality rate for children under 5 between 1990 and 2010 also decreased by about 50%. And we see this also gains in education, right? Between 2000, just within the last decade, we've seen school enrollments go up, about a 50% decrease in children who weren't in school. And we've seen these improvements happen in public health as well. Since 1990, a 47% decrease in maternal mortality. Since 2000, about a 26% decrease in global malarial deaths, and about a 33% decrease in global HIV infection rates. So again, I think this highlights how when we think about problems differently, and when we think about how not only do the material factors matter, but social factors matter as well, that wide-scale change is possible. And so what I'd like to, in conclusion, talk about, like, what were the takeaways from this talk? I'd hope you think that specifically that we talk about relationships in states. We talked about conflict, how our memories are sometimes drawn to adversarial relationships. I'm hoping by showing that how the social factors matter, social process matters, That despite that some would think that we're very locked into certain types of relationships with states because of strategic matters or economic matters, that social factors, if we add that to the equation, that we're usually not locked in, right? That change in relationships is possible. From the cynical nature, right? The cynical nature of our memories. I'm hoping what you take away is that by individually, if we start thinking about these problems differently, right, that we do not have to feel powerless in the face of atrocity, right? This doesn't mean that, that bad things do not happen in the international system. Unfortunately, they do. But it doesn't mean that we have to accept them either from a fatalistic or a cynical standpoint. And finally, so from the standpoint of I don't want this to be a pie-in-the-sky type of message, right? That if we just think differently, everything's going to be okay. But what I do believe is if we do start thinking differently, then soon collectively we will start thinking differently. And if collectively we are starting to think differently, then this lays the seeds where we can actually try and impact positive change, right? We can influence our leaders and our policymakers to think differently as well. And if we can do that, hopefully we can see more positive outcomes occur in the international system. With that, I'll go ahead and close, and I want to thank you again for being here this morning.